Many of us, at least as children, can remember the stories of Robin Hood. And Robin Hood is this mythical figure living in Sherwood Forest, robbing from the rich and giving to the poor. And he and his band are waging something of a guerrilla war against King John of England. And the story has grown with the telling of it. Now there is a whole host of other characters that accompany Robin and his nemesis, King John. There's Friar Tuck, Maid Marian. At times there is a Moorish soldier who is with them, kind of giving advice and science and these kinds of things. And it doesn't seem to be the case that the story of Robin Hood is going to go away anytime soon. It's one of the favorites for kids. And of course, Disney has put its stamp on the Robin Hood legacy, as well as other Hollywood movies. But something that's not always appreciated is the fact that the context for Robin's war against King John is actually the Crusades. At least the historical backdrop, the backdrop that's told normally with the historic story of Robin, is that King Richard the Lionheart, the rightful king of England, has gone off to the Holy Land to wage a crusade against the Muslim armies there in the hopes of retaking Jerusalem. And in his place, Richard has left King John, his brother, to rule the kingdom, and, at least according to the legend, King John is a bit of a bozo, and he makes the worst of it. And so Robin Hood and his merry band arise to resist the non-king, the brother of the king, who is a tyrant. Some scholars have even gone so far as to assume that Robin Hood is a man who has gone off to crusade, has learned the art of war, and coming back is something of a penniless man, and he realizes that the best thing he can do is ply his trade in war to make money for himself. And this might be the kernel of the idea as to why Robin Hood is such a good shot with the bow, or why he is such a fine warrior, and why all of his men seem to know how to fight better than even the local knights in England. And if we pull the lens back even further, the Crusades, of course, are one of the most important periods of time in both Western and in Near Eastern history. The onslaught of the West on the Holy Land, on Near Asia, in the hopes of taking back Jerusalem and Antioch and all of the regions that had been taken over by the Muslim expansion of the 8th century, is dramatically important not only for the Middle Ages, not only for the early modern period, but all the way down until today. The ongoing tension between the West and the East, particularly between the West and certain factions within the Muslim world, have caused a lot of people to say a very good deal about the Crusades. Often the comments are made that the West provoked Islam, that Islam was peaceful, that it was scientific, ruling with a generous hand, and that it was the greed of the Westerners, or the religious zealotry of the Westerners, that went and kicked the hornet's nest, sparking centuries upon centuries of warfare between Muslims and the Westerns. But the Crusades were not the first time that Muslims and Christians had squared off in war. Almost from the very beginning, the Muslim world and the Christian Western world were at war. Now, very often this did not necessarily mean that Christianity and Islam itself were at war. But since the nations that were representing the warfare, that were trying to expand into the same territories and were warring with each other for those spaces, were Christian-led armies and Islamic-led armies, it is hard to escape the fact that it looks like a war between two faiths. In one of the most important periods of time, and one of the most important cultures, where you see an intermingling and a friction at times between Islam and Christianity, is not the period of the Crusades, which is much later, but during the 8th to 11th centuries in the nation of Spain. Most people are unaware of the fact that by and large, for several hundred years, Spain was part of the Muslim world. It was conquered in the early 8th century as a result of some internal civil wars amongst the Muslim armies and the Muslims of the Near East, and a break-off faction fled and landed in Spain and conquered it relatively easily from the Visigoths. And as a result, they created what we today call Al-Andalus, which is the Islamic nation of Spain. Now, the interesting thing about Al-Andalus is that despite the fact that it was ruled by Muslims, it was not entirely Muslim. There were still vast numbers of Jews and Christians living under Muslim rule throughout Spain for these centuries. And so what we see is a very curious mix, a mix that we don't get for some time in the future, if not for very long after, in which you see these faiths, the Jewish faith, the Christian faith, and Islam, all living side by side, and at times going to war with one another, but at times trying to live with a certain amount of peace and distance between their cultures. And so in this lecture, we're going to pick up the story with the fall of the Western Roman Empire, and we're going to carry it forward through Visigothic Spain as it goes through some torturous debates over theology, and then we're going to look at Muslim Al-Andalus Spain, which existed all the way down until the 11th century. Well, taking a step back into the 5th century, you'll recall that Rome began to fall about the year 405. And we told the story of December 31st, 405, when the Rhine River froze and a host of barbarians fleeing from the Huns crossed over the Rhine River and began to wreak havoc and take over formerly Roman parts of the Western Roman Empire. And we can carry the story of those barbarians down into modern-day France and Spain. A number of these groups began to not spread towards Italy, but spread further out west. Many of them settled in the area of modern-day France, and many of these areas will eventually be conquered by the Carolingians, by Charlemagne, and by his predecessors. But prior to the rise of the Carolingians, these areas were dominated by barbarian tribes, by Gothic tribes, by any of a number of different groups. And one of the most important groups that came over the Rhine River and settled in the western part of the Roman Empire were the Visigoths. And with the Visigothic tribes coming down into the Roman part of the world, and with Rome being relatively ineffective at being able to put a stop to this, eventually Rome just concedes land to the Visigoths. And actually in the early 400s, a Visigothic ruler named King Wallia was actually given vast amounts of land in both southern France and in part of Spain. And we won't so much be focusing on southern France, but instead we'll be looking at Spain itself. And just as a start, we need to note that the Visigothic groups went down into Spain and settled there. Now, perhaps the most important element of this story is the fact that these Visigoths were not Orthodox Christians. That is to say, they were not Nicene Christians. These groups were Christian, but they were Arian. You'll recall that Bishop Ulfilas had gone up into the northern areas of the barbarians and the Gothics and had converted a number of the tribes to the Arian faith. And so as these groups come down into Spain, they are not part of the Nicene Church. They do not hold any allegiance to bishops that are Nicene, and they certainly don't have any love for the Pope. They are Arian, and in fact, they are pretty strongly committed to the Arian faith. And so from 418 all the way down until about 720, all the way down into the early 8th century, Spain is led by the Visigoths. And as early as the 5th century, the Visigoths also managed to spread down into North Africa and into other regions as well. And it was about the same time, as you'll recall, that Odoacer eventually deposes the last Western Roman Empire and declares himself to be king of Rome. Now, of course, Odoacer is never recognized as a Roman king. He is another barbarian leader, but in fact, he does have some authority because of the success that he's had over the Roman Empire. And by and large, Odoacer agrees to let the Spanish Visigoths have the space that they want out there. Now, the story of Spain might very well have ended there, at least in terms of its incorporation into the Western Catholic Church, were it not for the conversion of one of the later Visigothic rulers, a man by the name of Recared. And like any tribal group of the barbarian stripe or the Germanic stripe, many of the Visigothic tribes that were in Spain were not really part of a cohesive unit. Even though we today call them by a single name, the Visigoths, we shouldn't understand this to be that they had some sort of unified political identity. One of the problems of the Visigoths in Spain is that they were kind of fractious. They would go to war with one another. I always say it's a bit like the mafia. With the death of one boss, one strong leader, all of the sub-tribe leaders might very well go to war with each other and try to whack each other and try to see if they can become the new boss of the family. And in fact, that's exactly how Recared comes to the throne, and it's one of the influences that causes Recared to come to the Nicene Catholic faith. Recared's father, Leovigild, had, by some accounts, converted to the Nicene faith, and this seems to be a sincere conversion. He does seem to have had some breakthrough theologically, personally, and he seems to embrace the Catholic faith. However, shortly after doing so, he dies in battle with one of the local tribes. And it was his son, Recared, who at the Council of Toledo in Spain in 589 publicly declared once and for all that he was in favor of the Nicene faith. Now again, this does seem to have some personal element to it. Recared does seem to have converted to the Nicene faith. He has come to a conviction that Christ is equal with the Father in some way. But there are always political elements at play here. Recared does believe that the Nicene faith gives him some advantage in unifying the tribes, and it incorporates the Visigothic areas of Spain better into some of the other areas of the Roman world that were Nicene as well. And despite his sincere faith, Recared was nevertheless a bit of an egomaniac. He actually changed his name to Flavius, and he declared himself to be the successor to Constantine. Actually, he believed he was going to be at least the successor in the western half of the Roman Empire. Now, no one believes him, no one follows him on this. The rest of the Western Roman world doesn't even seem to acknowledge the fact that Recared has done this. But Recared believes that he has unified and brought together Visigothic Spain, and that he has united it finally under the banner of the Nicene faith. And so, from 589 down until 720, the Visigothic Arian kingdom has converted to the Nicene kingdom of Visigothic Spain. And for several hundred years, it is ruled as part of the Western Christian Empire. That is, of course, until the year 711. In 711, Tariq ibn Ziyad left Gibraltar, the area of the very southern tip of Spain, with about 7,000 men, and he landed on the southern part of Spain, mostly with the goal of looting and taking all kinds of treasure and taking it for himself and leaving. Just as a quick side note, the area known as Gibraltar actually takes its name from Tariq. The name, Gibraltar being this big rock, the name of it was Jabal Tariq. And you can imagine over time it gets kind of mashed together and Jabal Tariq becomes Jabal Tariq, and eventually it is westernized and anglicized into Jabal Tariq, Gibraltar. And the name of this being the Rock of Tariq, the Jabal Tariq, is derived from the fact that Tariq did not set out to conquer Spain, but when he landed and he sought about to loot many of the richer towns and urban areas of Spain, what he found was that Spain was ripe for the plunder, that there were lots of loose affiliations, not a lot of an army presence, and that he could very well conquer these regions with just 7,000 men without much trouble. At this time in 711, Roderick, the current Visigothic king, was away in the north fighting the Basques. Now the Basques are really those who have claimed to be the original natives of the Spanish regions. The Basques are living up in the northern part of Spain, and they are a constant nuisance for the Visigoths. They do not recognize the Visigothic kingdom, and they often will try to usurp and rise up and establish itself as a native kingdom within Spain. And so Roderick is off to the north, and as Tariq ibn Ziyad comes in with 7,000 men, he finds very little resistance. Entire cities and regions just simply cave and accept his leadership outright. Now, of course, with just 7,000 men, Tariq has absolutely no power to establish any type of local rule over these cities and these regions. And so, strange enough, very often what Tariq would do is he would conquer a region. He would then appoint either Christian or, in most cases, Jewish rulers over these regions. And then he would simply call for an alms tax. Now, this alms tax is very common in Islamic culture, particularly in the Middle Ages. And it's something that's not normally seen in the Western Christian world. And what it is when a region is taken over by an Islamic army, very often they don't initially have much concern that it be ruled by Muslims. They don't care about the day in and day out business of that region. They will eventually, of course, and there will be stiff penalties for, say, those who convert from the Muslim faith to the Christian faith or the Jewish faith. And the Muslim rulers will very often incentivize moving from Jewish or Christian faith into the Muslim faith. So, for example, you can't be a certain rank, a certain high rank of leader in many Muslim areas if you have not converted to the Muslim faith. But way off in Spain, far away from near Asia, Tariq ends up establishing a number of local rules, again, by Christians and Jewish leaders in the local community. And then he asks for simply an alms tax, a certain amount of money to be sent to him, far off in the east, as homage or as a tax, as being part of his dominion. And so it is that between 711 and 720, Spain is eventually conquered, at least loosely so, by the Muslim armies of Tariq, and it sets the stage for a widespread proliferation of Muslim culture that will come in just a number of years with the Abbasid Caliphate. Now, we need to say a few things about the developments within Islam that gave rise to Al-Andalus, Spain. And the first thing we want to look at is the development of the Caliphate. Muhammad died in 632 and left behind no real succession plan for those who would lead Islam. Muhammad's sons had not lived into adulthood, and it was decided that after his death, essentially a vote would be taken to determine the next ruler. And the first man chosen to lead was named Abu Bakr. And with Abu Bakr, you have founded something that is called either the Rashidu, which in Arabic is translated as rightly guided caliphates, and sometimes this is known as the patriarchal caliphs. That is to say, the early patriarchal leaders of Islam that were the caliphs. Now, we do need to pause to just note that the caliphs, and all the discussion we're about to have right now, does not have any bearing on the development of different Islamic nations or different Islamic empires. The caliphs were a specific order of ruling class in the religion of Islam itself. Now, of course, they had political power in many ways, and their presence was one of the most important things for an early Islamic nation. But there were other empires that arose over the years, political empires, that were Islamic and that did wage war on behalf of their faith, that were nevertheless part of the caliph system. So, for example, the Seljuk Turks, who we'll look at in a later lecture when we discuss the Crusades, were not part of the caliphate, and yet they were an empire. So what we're discussing now is the religious rulers. And so with the coming of Abu Bakr as the first caliph, there already was within Islam a bit of a tension that would eventually lead to something of a civil war. Because Abu Bakr was not the only possible choice to take over. There was Ali Talib, who was the cousin of Muhammad and who had married Muhammad's only daughter, Fatima. And Ali was passed over not once, but actually several times for the caliphate. And this caused some frustration. There were some who believed that Ali should, at least by the second or third occasion, have been elected. And so in 657, a break-off group from the caliphate moved to Egypt and rebelled, and they offered the caliphate to Ali. In this move, the rebellion in Egypt marks the major separation between the two major branches of Islam, the Sunnis and the Shiite Muslims. And the Sunnis were those who abided by the original caliphate structure, who abided by Abu Bakr and others, and the succession plan from there. But the Shiites were those who followed Ali. And today, it's really not much of a contest as to who is the dominant one. The Sunni part of the Islamic world today is about 88 or 90% of the Muslim world, whereas the Shia, or the Shiite Muslims, are roughly 10 to 12%. And the theology of the Shiites is far more apocalyptic. It always seeks, at least throughout history, to overthrow the Sunni dynasties and these kinds of things. But it is the Sunni Muslims who are by far the dominant force. And so there's a civil war that is eventually settled in 661, when the Sunnis went out and they established one of the most important caliphates and one of the early ones, which is the Umayyad dynasty. And the Umayyad dynasty centers the caliphate in Damascus. Now, today, the Umayyads are not well remembered. They are not considered to have been very successful during their reign. The Umayyads have lots of fighting, lots of infighting, lots of struggles, and they failed in two of their key areas. The Umayyads failed, first and foremost, with taking over areas that were occupied by the Eastern Roman Empire or by Byzantium. They attempted on several occasions, but by and large, the Byzantine world managed to hold the Umayyad dynasty back. But more importantly, in terms of the internal cohesion of Islam, the Umayyad dynasty, the Umayyad Caliphate, failed to put down the Shiite break-off faith. And so the Umayyads are not necessarily considered to be the glory days. But in 750, just a number of years after Tariq ibn Ziyad has gone into the Iberian Peninsula and conquered parts of Spain, there is an overthrow of the Umayyad dynasty, and the group that takes over is the Abbasid Caliphate. And the Abbasid Caliphate is considered one of the glory days, one of the golden ages of the Caliphate, because they take over in 750, overthrowing the Umayyads. And shortly after, in 762, they move the Caliphate from Damascus to Baghdad, making Baghdad for a period of time the real navel or the real center of the Islamic world. Now the Shiite faith, of course, doesn't go away, as I said, and what happens is the Shiite faith ends up creating its own caliphate, the Fatimid Caliphate, which will eventually take over a significant portion of North Africa. Extending from their starting point of Egypt, they head west, and they take over these regions for the Shiite faith. Now, this history is important not only for understanding the nature of Islam, for understanding the divisions that occur in early Islam, as well as for separating out in our minds the difference between the caliphate and subsequent empires or subsequent political regimes that occur within the Islamic world. But it's also important for the creation of Al-Andalus, because in 750, as the Abbasid Caliphate is established, there is a break-off group from the Umayyads. Those who survived the overthrow fled and moved to Spain. And the first leader to do this was Abd al-Rahman I. Again, he is part of the Umayyad dynasty that is now overthrown, and he takes a significant knot of forces and he flees to Spain, and he declares independence. And part of what's going on here, of course, is he's getting essentially geographically as far away from the Abbasid Caliphate as possible in order to defend himself from any real threat of invasion or of being overthrown by the Abbasids. And so, with Rahman coming, there is now established officially, and more fully than Tariq was able to manage with just 7,000 troops, an Islamic center in the Iberian Peninsula. And Al-Andalus, roughly, extends from this time of 750, with the Umayyad group moving into Spain, all the way down until 1031. Now, it doesn't remain unified, and this is one of the key issues. As Al-Andalus is established, there is a period of time when there is a clear succession in a singular unified political regime. There is also significant amounts of land that is conquered. In and around the late 900s, Al-Mansur, for example, actually wins vast areas of land throughout the Iberian Peninsula, all the way up into the northern regions, and he even manages to take Santiago de Compostela, which is, of course, one of the great shrines for the Catholic faith. And the government of Al-Andalus is something that we have to sort of focus on, because while this is a Muslim nation, while this is a Muslim territory, it is not part of the central knot of power that is located now back in Baghdad. It's a break-off group. And so, it is relatively vulnerable. Now, it doesn't break off ties entirely with the East, and trade between Al-Andalus and the Abbasids back in Baghdad and other parts of the Muslim world is actually quite successful, and it actually thrives and flourishes during this time. More importantly, because of the relative isolation of Al-Andalus, at least in terms of the political and religious fervor of the Islamic world, what Al-Andalus Spain becomes is a bit of a hybrid between what might have occurred if the Abbasid Caliphate had sort of extended its control fully into Spain, and what actually existed in Al-Andalus. And what I mean is, Al-Andalus was really in a vulnerable position. And so one of the experiments, you might say, of Al-Andalus is they attempt to live in some form of harmony with the Christians and the Jewish population that are still heavily presented in the Iberian Peninsula. There is no forced conversions, at least not on a wide scale. The policy in general is that Christians and Jews in Al-Andalus are supposed to be allowed to worship how they please. They're supposed to be free of any overt hostile takeover. Churches are not converted to mosques. Synagogues remain synagogues, and these kinds of things. Now, that doesn't mean that the Christian world or the Jewish world was necessarily free. Christians were not allowed to proselytize, for example. Missionaries or evangelists were not allowed to do their job. And so this is certainly at least oppressed or suppressed, though there is not necessarily any persecution that is happening during this period of time, not overt physical persecution at least. And historians have tended to glory in Al-Andalus because of this sense of tolerance that is a bit unexpected. But more importantly, though, art historians and architectural historians and just people who are intrigued with history, when you go to Spain today, you can actually still see elements of Al-Andalus. There is, for example, Alhambra, the great castle that was built during this time. And there are a number of other architectural and artistic expressions of Al-Andalus. But even these expressions, even this flourishing of architectural building and art, is really driven by the fact that Al-Andalus is seeking to win favor and to seek glory for the sake of security, for the sake of preservation. They are on their own. They are out there without the Abbasid Caliphate and now no Umayyad dynasty behind them. And so, as we said, the area of Al-Andalus holds these territories for some time. And as we mentioned when we were discussing Charlemagne and the Merovingians, the Frankish dynasties seek at times to take back the area of Spain. They go down into Spain, and at least under Charlemagne's reign, they fail pretty dramatically. And of course, the Battle of Tours, the great battle between Charles Martel and his armies and the rising Muslim armies, flow directly out of Al-Andalus and the desire of its rulers to take over other parts of Europe as well. But again, when the Islamic armies are defeated, it is often a surprise to people that the Islamic armies simply turn back and go down into the Iberian Peninsula and take their losses. There was no attempt to come back, no reinforcements were coming. But this actually makes a great deal of sense when you realize again that Al-Andalus is its own entity. There are not vast numbers of resources, of troops, or supplies that can be brought in from other parts of the Islamic world. It's Al-Andalus on its own. And with the loss of the Battle of Tours, there is this belief that they might as well come back and consolidate themselves within the Iberian Peninsula. In the end, the Christian world begins to respond, and there is a significant move as we get into the High Middle Ages to have a reconquest or a reconquista of Spain to make it again part of the Christian world. And the first significant person to do this is Alfonso VI, who in 1086 manages to capture Toledo, right in the heart of the Iberian Peninsula. Other Christian rulers attempt to take more and more of the Spanish region, and finally in 1236, the Muslim center of Cordova falls, and the Islamic world is pushed back to the area of Gibraltar. Now that's the political regime that is pushed back. For centuries, in fact, all throughout the Middle Ages, Spain will be actually a hybrid culture of Islamic culture, Christian culture, and Jewish culture. And all of these worlds will mix and mingle and sometimes clash in severe ways, but they have to endure side by side because of the kingdom of Al-Andalus. That is, of course, until all the way down until 1492, yes, just as Columbus is about to sail the ocean blue, the king and queen who commissioned Columbus, Ferdinand and Isabella, rose up and initiated a new reconquista. This time they not only pushed the Muslims out of the area of Gibraltar, and thus uniting all of the Spanish regions in general, but they also, unfortunately, enacted a policy of general forced conversion or, for lack of a better word, a bit of ethnic cleansing to try to establish once and for all a united Christian culture in the area of Spain. Their efforts were generally successful, at least in terms of outward conversion, but of course there have been a great number of studies on the hidden faith of Jews and Muslims after the Reconquista, after the period of the Reconquista throughout the High Middle Ages, all the way down until 1492. And so the Kingdom of Al-Andalus brings the Western world of the Christian kingdoms, particularly after the reign of Charlemagne, into a direct connection with the Islamic world. Now, it's not the entirety of the Islamic world, but Al-Andalus is a touch point between East and West, Near East and West, and between the Muslim world and the Christian world.